Because you're trying to discriminate, discern, figure out exactly what it is that Jesus is trying to say, and you're trying to do it and make sure you get it right. And it's one of the more difficult chapters, speaking of chapter 15, in that it provides some statements that need to be reconciled. So we're going to do our dead level best to do that, and to do it in such a way that we remain absolutely true and faithful to what Jesus actually said. So here's the first thing before we get started. I've never watched it. I've thumbed through it, seen it on TV, but there's a show on TV, the last 24 hours of ... And then it's some famous person that wound up dying, and it's the details of their last 24 hours. And we all know, like when we've had loved ones that have died or whatnot, we tend to remember those things that happened very close towards the end of their life. We recall them. And in fact, people are, it's almost morbid, I guess, but people are always interested in the death details. What is it that they said before they, this kind of thing. Well, the 24 hours of Jesus is upon us, kind of. These are the very last hours in John 15. And what he's doing, you have to remember the disciples in this period of time, the 40 odd days from the crucifixion / resurrection until the ascension. What do you think they were doing? Because the scripture doesn't say anything to tell us specifically. But my guess is what they were probably doing was huddling up somewhere going, remember he's talked about this. Remember he talked about this. Because they had already seen the resurrection. And they had been told, just cool your jets. You'll know when it's time to start. When it's time to start doing what you know you need to do. But in the meantime, in that 40 odd days, we don't hear much of the disciples. We pick up a story here and there where maybe there was an eyewitness account, but the details of those 40 days, my guess is there was a whole lot of time where the 11 were going, yeah, but he said this. Oh yeah, gosh, how's that going to apply? He said, and so they're just like the 24 hours of, they're rebuilding, if you will, the whole conversation. So we're going to be primarily in John 15, but here's a curveball. Before we go to John 15, turn to Psalm 80. 80, Psalm 80. And when you turn to Psalm 80, look at verses 8 to 18. Because this kind of sets the stage for John 15. In Psalm 80, verse 8, it says this: You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted the vine. You cleared the ground for the vine. The vine took root and the vine filled the land. The mountains were covered with the shade of the vine. The mighty cedars were covered with its branches. The branches reached as far as the sea, its shoots as far as the river. So Israel is being depicted here as a vine that has spread amongst the land that was given to it and had flourished. And then it says this: Why have you broken down its walls so that all that pass by pick its grapes? Boars from the forest ravage it, and insects from the field feed on it. Return to us, God Almighty. Look down from heaven and see the root your right hand has planted, the son you have raised up for yourself. Your vine is cut down, it is burned with fire. At your rebuke, your people perish. Let your hand rest on the man at your right hand, the Son of Man you've raised up for yourself. Then we will not turn away from you. Revive us, and we will call on your name. So the picture of the vine in Psalm 80, first of all, is one of flourishing. It's one of if you will, transposing this up to the current time of Jesus, when he goes to the ascension and he says, you're to spread this word to all disciples, make men of all disciples. He's talking about extend this vine just the way that it extended in Israel. But then there's also a picture of judgment. And it says, man, we've just been ravaged by, and the picture is there's these wild animals and there's these bugs, there's these insects. We need to be restored. So Jesus, if you remember, we just had the Last Supper. Who left at the Last Supper to go do what he had to do? Judas. Okay? So now the 11 are with Jesus, and Jesus is having a conversation with the 11. And it's very important to remember that's where that conversation starts, because we're going to, as we get into this a little bit more, we'll see how we should apply this to ourselves. Now, this is the way it reads in the NIV. And then I'm going to tell you that I'm going to change the words up a little bit because I believe it is biblically appropriate to do so. And I will explain why. And I think we have to be extremely careful when we start saying, oh, there can be another way that this can be read. But this is one of those cases where I think it is true. And so that's why I say you need to bear with me on this one, because I've tried to make sure that what we have done here is portrayed as accurately as what Jesus said as we can. So beginning in verse 15, it says, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He just went straight to Psalm 80, where he's telling people, Israel is, and he's saying, I'm the vine. So in the sense that in this new picture of the new Christian world that's about to start, the source of everything that's going to be in this Christian world is Jesus. And so he makes this incredible statement. And then he says, my Father is the gardener. So now we're into this picture of tending the vine. He cuts off, circle that. He cuts off, that's what it says in the NIV. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes. So it sounds like what's being said here is that if you are a believer of no fruit, you're what? You're cut off, which is at odds with what we've understood the message to be, and as we'll get into it. So there's the question mark. What is that? Is that interpreted correctly? And he says this part, that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Well, we know that's true with grapes and all these roses, for example. If you just let your roses grow crazy, they'll grow a bunch of little roses. If you prune your roses properly, they'll grow nice, big, healthy, but not as many, right? So it's the difference between, if the pruning is done correctly, it creates the best outcome. You are already clean. Who's he speaking to here? He's not speaking to us. Who's he speaking to? 11 disciples. And this is the last 24 hours. So this is going to be the stuff they're going to remember after the crucifixion that they have no clue is coming. You are already clean because of the word that I spoke to you. And then he says, remain in me as I remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. And he says, I'm the vine. So if you're going to bear fruit, it's going to be because you remain with me. You cannot bear fruit unless you remain in me. So he re-emphasizes. Again, moving down to verse 5, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you will bear fruit. But apart from me, don't count on that. It's not going to work. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Now, the extension of this for us, we need to think about this because we can see the whole picture. Matthew says, go into the world, make what? Disciples of all men. We've got the big picture. They didn't have it yet. So showing yourselves to be disciples would be, how do you show yourself to be a disciple in this context? Make other what? Disciples. That's what he's saying. So What do we have from this context? First of all, we have a very difficult statement. He cuts off every branch that bears no fruit. But we know this. Jesus is speaking to the disciples just after they had had the Last Supper. And this would have been just after Judas left to go do his deal. Judas is preparing his friends. Later in this chapter, he no longer calls them his disciples. He says, "You are now my friends." To understand what it will be like in the time after he is crucified, they don't have a clue what's coming up here. And this will be that time until they actually figure it out in Acts. Oh, so this is how we're going to spread the gospel. Because up until then, they were told to do what? Wait. Wait until you are given the power from God. Wait until you receive the Holy Spirit. Until then, stay calm. So he's kind of giving them some of these stay calm messages right there. Because eventually you're about to be the hands and feet that go into the world. And then there's a big phrase in here, in me. Keep that in mind, in me. What does that mean, in me? Well, in John, in me is there 24 times. Obviously, when you repeat a phrase that many times, you do it why? It's important. So in me is something every time you see in John, you need to go, okay, he's really emphasizing something here. These are just, I just picked a few of them. I picked three. In John 6:56, you don't have to go look it up, but if you want to just note it, it says, if you eat my flesh and you drink my blood, then you abide in me, and I abide in you. That's John 6:56. John 12:46, he says, I came as light into the world so that everyone who believes in me will not remain in darkness. And then in John 11:25-26, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. So what are we hearing there? Well, every time when he's using in me here, he's talking about a relationship that's sustainable. It's not going to be one that goes away. He's talking about you now know the difference between what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. What's dark, what's light. And that's important because transferring this to us today, there's way too many Christians that know what they ought to do, but don't necessarily spend much time doing what they should be doing. And then the third one would be, if you eat my blood, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, and basically what he's saying here, if you participate in the crucifixion with me, if you are part of that, then you will be, of course I didn't know what they were talking about at that point, but he's basically, that's what he's saying. In the Passover meal, he says, this is my body. And what he's saying is, the thing that delivered Israel from bondage is now something entirely different. This is delivering the world from bondage. But he was using the Passover to illustrate that. So those are the three things. You're part of this deliverance that's going to take place. You now know the difference between good and bad, and you're not going to die. Now, we shouldn't have to describe, that's not talking about physical death. That's talking about spiritual death. So those three things are really being made clear there, and that seems to bump up against this whole thing of where it says he cuts off every branch that bears no fruit. So there's this sustaining relationship. But verse 2, as we said, seems to say that they're burned up, and not only cut off, but they're cut off and burned up. So we need to keep digging. All right, so as we said, the 11 disciples are clean. What does he mean by clean? He's already used that language before as well. You can write this down. John 13, 10, and 11. This is what he said earlier. So when he says this isn't new language to them, and this is why you have to really be careful about just reading a chapter and thinking that you understand what's being said. Jesus didn't forget what he said. This is something that's already been there, and this is where it's at. He says, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but he's completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. So when he's making this statement about clean here, he's already told them, you guys are clean. And what does he say in 15:2? You guys are clean. He's just repeating the same thing. And then he goes and says, but one of you, not so much. One of you does not abide in me. So, what's up with verse 2? All right, so the Greek word that's translated as cut off in Greek, in Greek, the word is airo. Today we would spell it A-E-R-O, aero, aeronautics. The type of word that means to raise, to lift, to pick up.
Can you spell it again?
A-E-R-O.
Okay.
The old verb, the Greek spelling would be, if you transliterated it, would be A-I-R-O. Now it also means to remove. So it is not a stretch to say that cut off would mean that the word A-E-R-O would mean cut off. But when you read the rest of the things where he talks about I will abide with you, you will not taste death. This is not about salvation here that he's talking about. And first of all, why would he be talking to his disciples about salvation? His disciples were already, he says what? You are clean. He's not giving them instructions about all this other stuff. That's going to come from Paul. What he's telling them right now is that I want to talk to you about who you are, and I want to talk to you about this other guy. All right, so this is one of the things that Pliny the Elder, Pliny I think is the actual correct, this was a guy who was an early church father. He's relied upon for a lot of information. This is one of the things that he noted. That grapevines, when they train along the ground, they tend to try and get into they make runners that try and get into the soil. That's not what you want. You need your vines to do what? You need them to grow, to trellis. So what he discovered was, he talks about how the Romans brought some of these practices where you lift the vines up in order to allow the branches to have air flow through them, which then makes them less susceptible to the disease and to the animals and to the things that were in Psalm 80. And so when you do that, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can do it with a trellis. You can do it with rocks. He talks about the separate ways, but all of them the same thing was this. The gardener would come along, take these branches that weren't where they were supposed to be, that were not bearing fruit, and the gardener would pick these branches up and then get them into the proper place where they could produce fruit. That's the Greek word that's there. And the Greek word could be, instead of cut off, it could be lift up. Now, if you think about it from that perspective, what he's saying is, here are these people. And he's saying, I'm the vine. And there's going to be some people, there's going to be some cases where there is no fruit. And what the Father is going to do with these believers is he's going to pick them up out of the ground and he's going to get them in such a place that they can produce fruit. So, if you do not remain in me, and he says you're already clean. He said one of you is not clean. So now let's go to verse 6. If you do not remain in me, and this is I looked this up in the NIV this morning, the NIV commentary, where it says a branch, the commentary says the branch. It says that's the most literal translation. If you do not remain in me, you are the branch that withers, that is cut off, that is burned up. Who might that be? That's Judas. He just left the meeting. Go do what you have to do. It says Satan entered. And now he's telling the 11 that are still there, if you do not remain in me. Did Judas remain in him? No. You are the branch that withers. You are the branch that is cut off. You are the branch that is burned up. In other words, There's judgment coming to this guy. You know, you hear these hypotheticals. I wonder if Judas repented. If you read this, you have to say, no. No. Because it makes, this seems to be a definitive statement. Judas made his bed and he slept in it. But that's just the way it says it. So, let's do this in easy English for a second. This may have been what Jesus was trying to say. And the thing that's both fascinating, terrifying, humbling, scary, is to get inside Jesus' head. Not just to read the words, but to understand the purpose, the motivation. Why was he doing what he was doing? And if you don't try to appreciate that, then all you're doing is just simply reading without understanding. The problem is that sometimes with these difficult passages, you got to go, yeah, maybe, okay, I think this is what he's saying. But I do believe when you look at the Greek word and it talks about this, and then you look at how it talks about restore us as a vine out of Psalm 80. Put us back together. Let us follow you again. In fact, it says, bring us the Son of Man that sits at your right hand. And it's like, well, you asked for it. Here I am. So this might be it in easy English, right? John 15. You guys are okay. You're good. You're clean. But you're about to hit some really tough times. There's going to be some days in here after I leave. You don't even understand that yet, so I can't even explain it to you. But there's going to be some days when I leave that you're going to wonder, what the heck was I signing up for? You need to remember these words I'm telling you right now. You need to hang on to them. Hang tight. You're going to get some marching orders. They're just not there yet. And they're not going to come until about 50 odd days after the resurrection. Now, you don't know that yet, but you're going to figure all that out. And here's the deal about this resurrection. You don't have a clue what I'm talking about, even though I've been telling you. So I'm going to tell you that. This is why I'm telling you this story. So for the next 50 odd days, you're going to be fruitless. You're not going to be producing much of anything. You're going to be getting prepared. But what you need to understand is, while you're being prepared, the gardener is lifting up every branch that you have that is not going to be, that right now is not prepared to bear fruit. And I would say the disciples right then and right there were not prepared to bear fruit. Not yet. When did they become able to bear fruit? At Pentecost. When the Holy Spirit said, now I'm going to give you your marching orders. So for this 50 odd days, it's like you're going to be wondering what to make of all of this. And I'm trying to tell you, this is a time of preparation, just like Moses was prepared. These disciples are now being prepared for the job that will be in front of them. You are not fruitless. You are being pruned. You are being gathered up. The parts of you that are ready to go, they're going to be pruned. The parts of you that are not ready, they're going to be prepared to be ready. Now that's a totally different read than what 15:2 seems to suggest. The only way that makes sense is if the word arrow, which in that, by the way, that definition that I gave you just came out of Strong's Concordance. And Strong's Concordance says the first use of the word arrow is to lift up. So if that's the case, then this makes sense. By the way, my Father and your Father, He's the one that's going to be pulling you off the ground and propping you up. He's going to prepare you to produce fruit. And you're going to produce lots of fruit. You got no clue what's in store for you. The seeds of your work will be what spreads the entire gospel. So that's what he was telling them. And I think this is why it makes sense, because I can extend this into this argument a little bit further too. What about the believers? Forget, because this was a conversation with the 11. What about the believers who just don't produce much fruit? I don't even think Jesus had them on his mind. He left that for Paul. In fact, I think for most of them, it would even be a preposterous kind of a conversation. It's like, what do you mean I fixed Christmas dinner and you're not going to eat it? It would have just been, you're a believer. I mean, do I have to explain this to you? But in Jesus's case, he was talking to this very specific group of 11, and he's just saying, hang tight. He's not talking to them about some of you people after that would have been so far in the future that it would have made no sense to them. And trying to get inside Jesus's head to understand how he was talking to who he was talking to, I don't think that was on his mind at all. But it's obviously a problem. What about the folks who don't spend much of their believing lives doing anything that's productive? What does Ephesians tell us? It is by grace you have been saved, through faith, that not of yourself, not of work, lest any man should boast. And then we stop there, but it says, and now you are to do the good works prepared in advance for you to do. Fruit is good works is fruit. The biggest fruit is to spread the gospel. A work would be to be kind to your neighbor, to do something out of concern or compassion. But the biggest fruit of all is the seed of the vine that was Israel, that is now Christ, and now becomes the world. So what about these guys without fruit? Well, he talks about the one guy who did not acknowledge that the vine was there. He says he's been thrown away. He's going to be burned up. He's been cast out. So, what does Paul say about this? Well, you can write this in Ephesians 4:14. Paul's talking to the group and he says, you need to grow up. You cannot continue to act like a bunch of kids. Now, he's not saying they weren't in Christ. He's admonishing them to get serious about this stuff. This is what he says in 1 Corinthians 3. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet as though through fire. So again, I don't think Jesus is trying to give an illustration here except about Judas. It's not about losing your salvation. It's about abiding in him and doing the work that has been prepared in advance for us to do. And some people just ignore that. And Paul says, well, you're saved, but you're going into heaven with some asbestos underwear. Because it's going to get hot. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. The good works prepared in advance for you to do. Having one's work burned up, but you will still be saved, tells you that that's really not what Jesus had in mind in John 15. And then in Corinthians, in the church, in 1 Corinthians 11, a little bit further in that chapter, he had some of them that were taking communion, and they were getting drunk, and they were treating it like it was a festival. In other words, they were completely immature in this. And Paul says, okay, you keep that up. That's why some of you are weak. That's why some of you are sick. And it's why some of you have checked out. So you probably heard Tom say this before if you've been in Addis, and you probably heard it in other churches and other times. Does God take people off this planet if they are getting to the point where they are of no good to themselves or to others? And the answer is, according to Scripture, yes. He'll take a believer home, and just like Mama, when she goes outside and says, boy, it's 5 o'clock, come home, and the boy says, Mama, I do what I want to do. That might go for some mamas, but there's a lot of mamas that's going to say, no, I think we're about to straighten this one out once and for all. And when you tell God, I'm not coming in, that might be when God says, I hear that. So now let's see who the big dog really is. and now you get to go meet your Maker. That can happen. But it's not about, that's the ultimate, I think, insult to God as a believer, is to say, I'm too busy to do your work. When a Christian tells God, I'm too busy to do your work, that is truly a slap in the face. And I've heard so many preachers make excuses so many times about, hey, I know we're all busy. I know, yes, and yes. But if you had to sit down and tell me how many hours you spent yesterday on Facebook, or if you had to sit down and tell me some of the things you did that have nothing to do with what could have been, and look, don't forget, what did Jesus do after he got through with something? He got, I've had enough of y'all. He went off to the mountain to be by himself. There's a such thing as appropriate quiet time. And it is deserved, it is needed, it is necessary. But I will suggest to you that what a lot of people call a busy life is really nothing more than a lack of priorities, where we don't establish any kind of self-discipline in our lives, and then we have nothing to show for it. And this is the kind of stuff, those are the works that are not works, and they get burned up by fire. So, the people that are doing that, that's not what John 15 is talking about, but oftentimes John 15 gets brought into that conversation. That's why this is so tough. The Lord does not reject those people that are not producing fruit. The gardener comes in and picks the grapevines up and challenges these grapes to do what? You're not in that mess anymore. Produce fruit. That's what sanctification is. Sanctification, if we want to use that visual imagery, is having my vines taken out of the dirt, out of the mud, out of all the places where they don't need to be, having those vines brought up to the trellis, let these vines begin to grow, let these vines begin to flourish, and then the gardener comes along and goes, man, you're producing so much fruit, you know what I got to do? I'm going to chop a little bit of this back. You're going to get a haircut. Sorry, Matt. You're going to get a haircut. You're going to get a haircut and produce more fruit. And it's like, that's not a problem. This is great. But if we read this the wrong way, it seems to say that it's our job to produce the fruit. And it is, but it's a result of being tended to by the gardener. It's not because of our own efforts. Some believers today, too many, walk foolishly and suffer judgment. Not because they had to, just because they asked for it. There's others who profess to be a believer, and they're like Judas. Judas never believed. Judas knew who Jesus was, and he rejected him. This wasn't confusion. He didn't like the idea that I thought you were coming to get rid of these people. Since you're not going to be the God that I want you to be, you're not my God at all. But I like hanging around here because I get to rob from the money bag. And that's what he says. That's why he was really upset at Mary and Martha. It's like, you know how much money we could have put in our bag for that? Well, you know how much I could have skimmed off the top? So the scriptures tell us, Paul makes it clear, that believers can be unfruitful, but he doesn't say they're going to lose their salvation. And so now we see the grace of God and the character of God, that once a person becomes a true acceptor of who Jesus was, what does that mean? Well, Paul explains that. These people don't even know what a true believer of Jesus is yet. A true believer of Jesus is that Christ lived, Christ died, Christ was resurrected for the redemption of sins. That's the true believer. And all of those historical facts now extend to me as a believer, and I get the same benefit. Since Christ lived and died, I will live, I will die. I do not have any sins to be redeemed from anymore because Christ has already done that. And that is the believer of today. So chapter 16, if you turn there, you'll see after all of that discussion, this is what he says in verse 1. I've told all of you this, and who are they? This is the 11. I've told you this so you will what? Not fall away. Because these were the guys that were going to do what? They're going to spread the gospel. If they screw it up, there ain't nobody left. And he's saying, I've told you this so you will know, so you will understand, so you can, while you're in this season of 40 odd days of going, what just happened? And you're sitting there asking, what were the last 24 hours? What did he tell us? How did he say it? What did he mean? All of those things are going to start coming back to you. They will put you out of the synagogue. That's a fact. Acts tells that that happened. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. Who do you think he may have had in mind there for just a brief moment? That might have been Paul. People like Paul. Very truly, going down to verse 20. You will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. What is he talking about there? The crucifixion. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. The crucifixion. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So what he's saying is, just like that lady, hang tight here for about 40 days, guys, because it's going to be painful. Now is your time of grief. They didn't understand. But I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. And then he goes to verse 25. I've been saying all this, speaking kind of figuratively, but there's going to be a time coming when I no longer use that kind of language, but I'm just going to tell you plainly about my Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I am not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and entered the world. Now I'm leaving the world and going back to the Father. He is leaving them with their last statements. Then Jesus' disciples said, as they were often wont to do, they still thought they understood it, but they didn't. Now you're speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. What an incredible statement from the apostles just moments before Jesus dies. And you think they got it, but Jesus says, yeah, do you really believe right now? And he knew the answer. A time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each to your own homes. You will leave me all alone. That doesn't sound like belief. That sounds like unbelief. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with you. So he's preparing them for all of that. Not only are you going to be fruitless, you're going to be scattered. And I anticipated all of that, Jesus says. And I got it covered. And you'll understand all this, but you won't understand it on Friday. That's going to take Sunday. So it's like that old preacher said, Friday's here, but Sunday's coming. And for these guys, it was the notion of you have to be prepared. You are my closest followers. You have no idea what this is going to do to your world. So listen to what I'm saying. Don't be surprised if you get pruned back. Judas has already been, he's withered, he's out. But you guys, you need to sustain. I've told you all of these things so that in me you may have peace. You would think that's one of the things they must have really talked about for 40 days. Whatever he meant, whatever was going down. We saw him here. We saw him there. Some other people saw him. 500 people saw him. We still don't know what this all means. He just told us to hang tight in Jerusalem. Don't go anywhere. So we're going to do that. And this must have been, those words must have been providing them peace. They had to be. He didn't leave them with any other. So that you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world. So the last words that are being said to the disciples are so profound, but yet they have so much meaning to us. Because this whole idea of, I'm not going to leave you fruitless. The people that are fruitless are the people who do not abide in me. They are not clean. They are traitors. There's two types of people in the world, those who believe and those who don't. That's it. And he's saying, those people that believe, I will stand by you. I will be with you. Even if you wind up going into heaven with no works, you'll still go there. But my goodness, don't let that be your life. That's what Jesus is saying. That's what Paul is saying. So tying all of this together and getting a picture of what Jesus was trying to tell his disciples in John 15, I think we have to be careful about how we understand that particular chapter and what he's trying to do with his people. But that should give us great comfort when we sit there and ask ourselves, am I pleasing God? And the answer is, well, if you are, if you're really doing the work of the Lord, don't be surprised if you get pruned. And if you're not, don't be surprised if you get your vines raised. Either one of these are example. One of them is use what you have, and the other one is let me provide for you what you need so you can do what you should. It's a great picture. Father, we thank you for the grace, the mercy, the love, the willingness to continue to work on us, to make us the vine, the branch that depends on the vine, the branch that bears fruit. And we know that the branch can't make a better grape than the vine already makes. So it's not about our seeds. It's about the seeds that we are now abiding with and able to spread. Just like the 11 and eventually the 12, as they were replaced and became the 12 again. Just like the 12 were primarily responsible for going into all the world and spreading the gospel, making disciples of all men, today we are given the same charge. Mostly, for most of us, that will extend within our place of business, our homes, our churches, our neighborhood. But it's no less important, because the one thing we know is that you don't have to go very far today to find someone who thinks Christianity is a joke. They laugh at it. They mock it. They smirk. Therefore, the ground is ripe. The harvest is ripe. The people to harvest, however, are sometimes busy doing something else. May we be the church where you do not have to spend time lifting us out of the dirt. May we be the church that you continually prune because of the fruit that we're producing. It's in your Son's name we pray, and everyone